Welcome to Unapologetically Sensitive, a place to find connection, a sense of belonging, and community, where you can learn, relate, laugh, and maybe even live a bolder, brighter life. I'm your host, Patricia Young, licensed clinical social worker. The information in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. This is a weekly podcast where we explore how sensitivity weaves itself into our lives. We talk about the richness that it adds, the strengths we have because of our sensitivity, and some of the challenges it poses as well. Sensitivity is nothing to apologize for. It's our superpower. Hey there, to the creatives, healers, sensitives, and deep thinkers. This is episode 18, and today I'm talking with Sara Wachter-Boettcher, who's a co-host to the podcast Strong Feelings. Sara talks about the importance of centering on women's voices in media and the importance of showing women in deep, rich, emotional conversations with each other, how powerful it can be when we're vulnerable and open and honest with each other. There's a piece of feminism that says women's experiences matter, and women's emotional lives matter, and there's nothing soft or weak about letting that shine. We talk about how having a career and raising a family, all that responsibility tends to fall on the woman, and how rare it is that a man is asked, how do you manage your career and family life? It's really a wonderful episode. Sara does not identify as a highly sensitive person, so there really are no questions in this episode about that. And then in one part of the conversation, she's talking about something, and my brain just went offline, and what I meant to ask is, was she talking about mansplaining? And instead I said manscaping. So we have a little bit of a conversation to clarify that I used the wrong term. I just left it in there because it's really part of who I am, is letting you guys see when my brain goes offline. Let me tell you a little bit about Sara. Sara runs Rare Union, a strategy consultancy, and co-hosts Strong Feelings, a weekly podcast about living your best feminine life at work. She's also a keynote speaker and the author of 3 tech design books, Technically Wrong, Sexist Apps, Biased Algorithms, and Other Threats of Toxic Tech, Designed for Real Life with Eric Meyer from A Book Apart, and Content Everywhere from Rosenfeld Media. Her work has been featured in The Washington Post, Slate, The Guardian, and more. And she's spoken at dozens of events across 4 continents related to tech and design. If you've been considering therapy but aren't sure if you're ready, I have a couple of thoughts. If you go back to bonus episode 32 called Do Therapists Have Therapists? I talk about some of the misconceptions about therapy and my beliefs about what therapy is about. The research says that about 50% of clients in therapy are highly sensitive people. It makes sense. We really want to know about ourselves and we want to live our best lives. If you live in California and you're curious about telehealth, which means we meet on a platform similar to Skype, but this one's private, I offer a free 20-minute consultation. If you want, we can jump on a call similar to Skype online so you really get a chance to see how it feels to talk with me over an online platform. We can talk about what your goals are. I can let you know how I would address them. We can see if we're a good fit. No obligation at all. If you're interested, you can hop on over to patriciayounglcsw.com to find out more and to get in touch with me. All right, and on to the show. Hey, Sara, welcome.
Hey, thank you for having me.
I am so excited to have you here today. I discovered your podcast. I'm not even sure how I discovered it, called Strong Feelings. So I wanted to have you on today to talk a little bit about what the focus of your podcast is, some of the struggles that you've had, the wins. So Do you want to tell me a little bit about your podcast?
Sure. So Strong Feelings is a weekly podcast with my best friend, Cattell Ledoux, and she's actually more and more becoming a business partner too. So we work together on some things and we talk about that. We talk about work. We talk about friendship. We talk a lot about feelings. And the biggest thing that shapes all of it, I think, is just that we take a feminist perspective to it. So we're really looking at what are the things that are difficult or challenging about work, and sort of what are some of the systems and structures that exist that make work so hard for women so often, and what kinds of issues do they tend to face in their careers. We also talk a lot about sort of intersectional issues. We bring in a lot of guests from lots of different backgrounds and really aim to make sure that when we're talking about issues related to work and we're talking about how our emotional relationship to our work, that we're hearing from people who aren't just women like us. We happen to be two white women who are in professional careers. And so we want to talk to people who are very different from that, and different ages and races and backgrounds and from different places. And then also, working in activism with artists, authors. But what I think is really interesting about it, and what's been amazing about it, is that we hear all of these stories about sort of like how people navigate the choices that they have in their work and sort of what drives them forward, and then what they do to kind of pursue the things that matter to them, despite the kinds of toxic messages or backlash that they might get as women out there who are being ambitious. I feel like no matter who we talk to in whatever field they're in, whatever background they're from, we learn so much about sort of how to navigate our own choices and how to process our own feelings about work. And so that is what we do.
Wow. And what I love is you have some great in-depth conversations. That's really what drew me in about your podcast. Can you tell me why feminism is important to the podcast?
Sure. Well, I think that, there's a lot of reasons. One of them is that when you look at podcasting and you look at the shows that are sort of interview shows or conversational shows, historically, most of those have been very much driven by male hosts, and you're starting to see this change. That's only been in the last couple of years that you've really seen a lot more women in podcasting sort of gaining prominence. And I think it's important to center women's voices. And in our show, we think it's really important to center women's voices, to show women in conversation with each other, to have women in deep, rich, emotional conversation with each other, to show how powerful it can be when we are open and vulnerable and honest with each other. I think that in a lot of environments, women are really taught that to get ahead, they need to kind of stuff all their feelings down, and that that's what professionalism means. And they're taught that to be good at their jobs, that they should be more unfeeling, more stoic. And then often they're perceived as unlikable when they are those things. And what we're really trying to say is like, look, we're extremely good at what we do. We are competent, we are ambitious, and we are successful. And guess what? We are also people who are unashamed to say like, yeah, and I cried twice today, and that's fine. And I'm still good at what I do, and I'm still competent, and I'm still successful. And so we think that there's a big piece of feminism that's just about being able to say women's experiences matter and women's emotional lives matter. And there is nothing soft or weak about letting that shine.
I love that. I think too that there's such a male paradigm, and that when we look at language, that a man is strong or assertive and a woman is, I don't swear on this podcast, so if you say itchy and you add a B to it.
Sure. Yeah. That was the kind of thing that we talked a lot about when we were first starting out, was in the conversations that we have with our women friends over and over again. It's like the same kinds of themes would come up, right? I was told that I was too aggressive in my review. And then I was also told that I needed to speak up more in my review. Those kinds of themes that pop up over and over again, where there's so many double standards and so many sort of like, narrow tightropes women are somehow supposed to walk in order to be perceived as just right at work. And the reality is that you can spend your entire life trying to do it just right. So like, okay, I want to be taken seriously, but I don't want people to think that I'm being a B. I need to sort of assert my authority, but like, oh, don't be too assertive. Make sure people think I'm nice. Am I likable enough? Am I wearing the right thing? Do I look put together? Do I look cute, but also don't look sexy? I don't want to be sexually harassed. Like all of that. You can spend your whole life on that stuff and still you're still going to get the same messages that somehow you're not living up, right? That you're not doing enough, that there's something about the way that you're presenting, or there's something around the way that you're speaking or not speaking that's wrong. And so what we're really trying to say is like, look, we deserve to have a space where none of those rules apply, and where we can talk with women about the things that matter to them on their own terms. And we can, share those with more people so that people feel less alone in some of these choices that they're making, and less alone in some of those, like processing those toxic messages that they get.
Right. I think so much that sense of isolation comes from this idea that who we are is not okay and how we show up in the world is not okay. And so we need to project this image of what it looks like for everybody else, which really creates a sense of disconnect from our authentic selves. And just what you're saying, that when we learn that if I need to have a cry, I need to have a cry. And if I'm having strong feelings about something, I'm having strong feelings. It's part of who I am. Then we're able to show up authentically. And I think that when we get stuck in that imaging of what we think we're supposed to be, that's often where a lot of the competition between women comes from, which is so damaging. It's just so incredibly damaging.
Yeah, we've talked about some of those issues on the show, and one of the things we did a while back that was really great, it was really, really powerful, was we actually brought Catel's therapist onto the show. And Catel was, at first, she was her idea, and then she was like, oh my gosh, have I made a terrible mistake? And then she was like, nope, I'm going to put this out there that A, I'm in therapy, B, therapy is great, C, I'm willing to say like, yep, I go to therapy, this is the person I talk to. And one of the things that she said to us that I will never forget was, she was like, look, you can be a hot mess and sturdy and successful at the same time. Like, all of those things can be true at the exact same time. And it doesn't say anything intrinsic about you except that, like, right now you're crying, right? Like, there's nothing about that has to like define you. It just is, and it's okay. And I think about that conversation a lot. And I also think about the kind of feedback we got from that conversation, because what we heard over and over again from listeners was that it sort of gave them, they felt so much like they had permission, right? They felt like they had permission after listening to it to show up more as themselves and to be more honest about the stuff that they're struggling with. And so we try to focus on that a lot. When we started the show, we actually started it out with a third co-host, our friend Jen, and it was called No You Go. And it was largely the same kind of format. When Jen decided that she needed to leave the show in the fall, Catel and I were really sitting down and going like, okay, well, what's the future of this and how does it change? And we decided that, at that point, we had such a clear idea of what we wanted to do with the show that it just hit us that the name Strong Feelings was so perfectly right. And we decided like, we need to rebrand this because it's too important, right? We need that message to be front and center.
Yeah. And I call it the power of the and I had a guest on, Justine Frolker, and she's really the one that has a TED Talk called The Power of the And, which is exactly what Catel's therapist said. You can be a hot mess and you can be successful. And I think often what happens is, especially as women, we're shamed so much for our vulnerability or for our feelings. And then we feel like that's all of who we are. And so today I had a big boohoo and a big sob, and I'm here doing an interview with you because like I let myself have my feelings, I moved through it, and I'm moving on. Like, both can exist in the same experience. And I love that thought of, especially being a therapist, so much of my message is about, just because I'm a therapist doesn't mean that I've worked through all of my stuff, and that my podcast is a place to show that I still struggle with things. And I think that there's such a tendency to want to hide that from people because it feels like it's not okay, that the image of success doesn't mean that we show what our vulnerabilities are. And so that message of you can be a hot mess and you can be a success, I think is so incredibly powerful.
And, this goes back to, I think in my book, this goes back to the feminism angle, and is something that I've thought a lot about, which is that I think that in a lot of sort of male dominated business culture, there is a lot of emphasis on kind of glossing over anything that makes you feel vulnerable. It's a very typical approach. And I think it's a bad approach for a lot of reasons. And I think one of the reasons that it's not helpful is that people can't learn from that. people don't learn anything from your story of being awesome and everything going great all the time. That is not actually helpful to somebody else trying to learn from you. And so I want to talk to the people that we have on the show. And for my own stories, I want to tell my own stories that are not perfect. And I want to talk about how, for example, I do a lot of public speaking. People often assume that that must mean that I'm totally comfortable in like social settings and networking situations, and that I don't get nerves when I get up on stage. And like, that is not true at all, right? I am a human just like other humans. I am still nervous when I do public speaking. I have definitely gone through various phases of like high anxiety around it. And then, also various phases of feeling a little calmer and a little bit more like owning it. I still go to, networking receptions at conferences where I'm giving a talk and I stand there with my little tiny plate of cheese cubes and look around and go, I don't know anybody here. How am I going to ever enter a conversation? And being able to talk about that for what it is and to say like, yeah, that's true. And then also I'm going to go give a keynote talk and people are going to tell me it was the best thing they saw at the entire event. That's what it's like, right? Like success is not some sort of pure thing that doesn't have any down parts of it. And the stuff that I have pursued and that I feel like people look at me and say, oh, wow, you must have it all together. It's like, that's true-ish, right? Like some of those things are true, but they are only one side of it. And it's not like my life doesn't have all the rest of that human stuff. And I think that what that does is it allows people to see those kinds of successes, whatever they are, as more accessible or more approachable, right? Like it feels really distant to be in a place where you could do something like stand up and give a talk and like have no stressful feelings about it and just be like, yeah, no big deal. I just do that. That is very hard to do. It is a little easier to imagine yourself saying, oh, yes, even somebody who's an experienced speaker gets stressed before they have to speak. It's okay if I'm feeling stressed. People can go up there and feel stressed and still do it anyway. Like that is a much more realistic way of looking at it. And so I think that that's one of the reasons it's so important to me to be really open about the things that are hard, because, people feel so alone, like they're the only one who struggles with stuff if we don't talk about the hard parts.
Absolutely. And I think that people often have this misconception of, I have to get enough courage. And when I get the courage, then I can do the thing that I'm afraid of. And it's really about allowing yourself to feel the fear and doing what you're afraid of, because that constant act of feeling the fear and doing what you need to do builds the muscle of courage. And we don't talk about this. And this is where I think there's so much, it's kind of like there's magic in the mess in the middle, that place of not knowing, but being willing to be uncertain and to move forward is where we really get kind of growth and all kinds of great things.
Yeah, I was just writing recently about sort of why I think more people in my field in tech and design should write and speak about their work, even though they don't feel like they're experts yet. Because I've talked to tons of people. I did some research on this too, where I was asking people, well, what's keeping you from sharing some of your ideas or sharing your work? And over, they'll say the same stuff. It's like, well, I'd like to do that, but I don't think I have enough experience. I see all these other people and their stuff is amazing, and I don't think I can measure up to that. But when I have quote unquote enough of it, then I'm going to do it. And, what I've realized is that moment doesn't come, right? There is never enough. There's always going to be a nagging feeling that says, I don't know enough yet, or I don't have enough courage or confidence yet. If you let that always be the answer, then you're never going to be able to do the things that you want. And that doesn't make it easy. And obviously, speaking or writing, that's not for everybody. I'm not saying that that's for everybody, but what I'm hearing is all these people who say that they want to do it, and they're held back from that feeling of like, well, maybe in a couple more years. And I really think that is a message that, we tell ourselves a lot. And that's also a message that people who want to maintain the status quo of who has power will push, because it keeps them allowed to sort of like hog the spotlight, right? Like you don't have to share the spotlight if you keep telling the people who are coming up that they don't deserve to be there. I really push back against that and really think practically about like, okay, if you don't feel like you have the confidence yet, let's work on the process of taking a step back and saying, okay, well, what are the things you do know about? What are the things that you have accomplished? What's the stuff that you didn't know how to do a year ago or 6 months ago that you can do now? Let's actually like talk about that and document that and look at that. And when you look at that in total, suddenly you can highlight, oh, wow, actually, maybe I do know a lot about this thing or that thing, and build enough confidence to share that with people. And then you realize that, the stuff that you take for granted is like everybody already knows that already. They don't. And they have things to learn from you. We all have things to learn from each other.
Yeah. And there have been times I have two comments and they totally contradict each other. So I'm kind of struggling about, if I bring them up, it sounds like I'm totally contradicting myself, which in some ways I am. One of them is sometimes it's really about just having the courage to put yourself out there. And that sometimes what's been helpful for me is I look at the people that are putting themselves out there and I go, I've got a lot of information that I can share also. So that's one of the things that sometimes people just have the guts and they put themselves out there and they become successful because of that. And there aren't people that either talking about or doing the things that these folks are doing. I know the other thing that where I struggle the most is fearing judgment by my peers. I don't fear judgment so much by people that aren't my peers, but I really fear judgment by my peers. Does any of that resonate with you?
I mean, absolutely. And so I have done quite a lot of very visible work for my professional community in that, like, I've written books and given, like I said, lots of talks and written articles. And I've just kind of like decided to be out there, right? And to say, I have an idea and you know what? I'm going to put that stake in the ground. I'm going to publish it and see what happens. But just because I've done that over and over again over the course of, I guess, like 7 or 8 years now, it doesn't mean I don't have those feelings. I am intensely afraid of the judgment of my peers. I am intensely afraid of being exposed as a fraud or a charlatan, right? Those feelings come up all the time. I guess that the only thing that is different maybe for me is that I look at those feelings as those are feelings. They are not the only feelings that I have, right? Like I have these other feelings and I have to take a moment and like say, okay, maybe having a wave of that fear right now, but I may also be getting a wave of excitement to share something that I've learned. Or maybe I get a wave of, like an intense desire to get the word out about something that I think is important, that I think other people in my industry should be paying more attention to. To say that there's no reason that fear feeling has to win every time, that the fear of what people are going to think of me can be just one part of the fabric of feelings that I have, and allowing it to control what I do or I don't do is not going to serve me at all. It's not going to help me grow at all. It's not going to allow me to be the person I really want to be. And so, to be able to kind of like accept that I have those feelings. I don't know that I'm never going to not have them. I mean, like the intensity of them has shifted and sort of how often they're triggered has shifted the more I've done things, but I'll probably always have those feelings. But I kind of like, observe them with a little bit more distance now. And I don't just let myself sink into them and live there.
Yeah. One of my favorite books is Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert. Have you read it by chance?
I have not read it.
So she wrote Eat, Pray, Love. I love every book that she comes out with is so different. And this is a book on creativity, which creativity just fascinates me. And I often talk about this part of her book on the podcast frequently, but she talks about fear. And she says, if you're going on a road trip, fear doesn't get to sit in the front seat. It doesn't get to hold the GPS. It doesn't get to choose what you listen to on the radio station. Fear can sit in the back seat, which is just what you're saying. Like the feelings of fear are probably going to keep coming up, but I can turn the volume down on them. So fear gets to sit in the back seat. I decide what I listen to. I decide where I'm going. And I think that the more we get that message out that we can have these feelings and we can still do what we need to do, create so much power, because I think that we have this false illusion. And I think there's a lot of advertising that says, take this course and you will have freedom and success. There's nothing that says, take this course, feel the fear and do it anyway, which is really what the reality is.
Yeah, it is. And also, feel the fear, do it anyway. And also some of what you do isn't going to work out. And that's okay, right? Like some of what we do doesn't work out. That doesn't necessarily mean anything about you. I think that we are so quick to sort of cherry pick the negative experiences or the negative feedback and to use that as our whole story, when there are so many examples of positive experiences or positive feedback that you could turn to instead. And so I think it is getting aware enough about yourself and your particular triggers and your particular vulnerable spots. Like, what are the things that kind of freak you out or hurt you a little bit? Getting clear enough on what those are that you can look them in the eye. And like you said, yeah, I get it. You're coming along on the road trip, and maybe it's okay. It's kind of like, it's good to see you, but yeah, you're not running the show here. Because I do think also that those fears, I mean, they serve a purpose, right? Like, it is not irrational to have some fear of what your peers might think if you're putting yourself out there professionally. That's a rational thing to be afraid of. And I think particularly, I really try to emphasize this when I'm talking about, anybody who's from a marginalized or underrepresented group in their field. So in tech, it's definitely women and particularly women of color, and really anybody who's not white, but especially I would say women of color, so underrepresented and often so marginalized in the companies that they're working for, that the fear of what their peers will think is a real and valid thing. And I don't want to tell people that they shouldn't have it, because there are people who get harassed or attacked by their peers or denigrated by their peers or treated like their ideas are less than simply because of their identities. I think it does nobody any good to pretend that that's not something you should be concerned about. I think that it's, so it's like your brain is trying to keep you safe, right? Your brain just might be going into overdrive trying to keep you safe by telling you don't ever do anything that might let anybody criticize you ever. But that's what your brain is trying to do. And you can look at that and you can say, okay, I see what you're trying to do there. And there are some valid reasons for that. And, the more vulnerable position you're in, the more valid those reasons. But that's just one part of the story. And, I'm going to take that in as one piece of information in the broader picture of how I make decisions about whether I'm going to do something or not.
Sure. I love what you said, and there's so much there. I think I want to go back to, not right now, but I want to talk about marginalized groups and the fear of what their peers think. But what I want to jump to is, when you were talking about, it's not always about the success, that it's really about the power of the process. And we learn by what doesn't work, but we have this tendency to go like, I should have known. And how can we know if we've never done it before? And I think there's so much power in that.
Well, absolutely. I mean, we don't know about things that we haven't done before. I just had a conversation earlier today in a group that I'm in with a woman who was putting on a workshop for the first time. So, a company contacted her, was interested in her having her come in and teach a workshop to them about a topic. And she hadn't done that before. And so she went and she did it. And then afterwards, it's like she hit some snags where it's like, they didn't get her set up as a vendor correctly. So now the company can't figure out how to pay her, or like the people who ran the workshop were really hands off with organizing sort of the flow of the day. And, she's like, there was no snacks. There was no break planning wasn't done. And it was like, oh, I should have asked all these questions beforehand. I'm like, well, I mean, sure, it would have been great, but you didn't know to ask all those questions beforehand because you hadn't done this before. The reason that you now know that you should ask, like, okay, this is a 4-hour workshop. We need to take a break. People will need a snack. It'll be hard to retain focus. Can you get some snacks sent in? To ask those questions now because you have the experience of doing this. And that is all that we can do, is just learn from the things that don't go quite right the first time. And obviously ask questions and try to learn from other people who've done it before. I think that that's helpful too. But I think that we have such unrealistic expectations for ourselves so often that we always should have known better. Well, how should we have known better? Why should we have known better? Where were we supposed to have learned that from? I think so much of what we experience day to day in the world is unpredictable. And so I think it's just another way to blame ourselves, because blaming yourself is the easiest way to make sense of any situation. I think that it really comes down to that, is that, the safest person to blame is yourself, right?
Right. And I think that especially as women, I mean, my guess is that for highly sensitive men, I think that this rings true also, that we have that sense of perfectionism and wanting to do all the research and to get it right. And so the focus is on not making mistakes, where I think that when we focus on the process, how can we know what we don't know? Mm-hmm. So it's really a shift. So I want to tell on myself a little bit about when I had reached out to you about being on the podcast, because this really fits right in with the process that as I'm growing the podcast, I'm listening to podcasts and finding podcasts that I really like and looking for people that might be willing to be a guest. And so it really means putting myself out there too. It feels like they're big asks for me, and I'm really all about doing the ask, and it doesn't mean that I'm going to get what I want. So when you had initially responded and you asked about the demographics and how many listeners I had per episode, the story that I made up in my head, and because I don't know you, Sarah, I want to be really clear that this is about me. This is like, you didn't do anything wrong. This is just how I process. The story that I made up in my head is, oh my gosh, you have a big podcast. I'm just a little fish in a little pond, and I'm not worth it to you. And I think I commented, I'm hoping in a polite way, saying, I'm wondering if you're seeing if this is worth your time. Do you remember that? And what was your response when you got that message back from me?
I do remember that. And I had a moment where I thought, oh gosh, well, I'm sorry that I made her feel like that. I think that, that's such an easy reaction. And the thing is, it's like, it is important for me to know sort of what I'm getting into and who is going to be listening. And for some people, though, it is also going to be important for them to make decisions about, where they spend their time based off of things like audience. And I think about that, and like, I think that also it would have been okay I think it's an okay thing to do to say, actually, that's not a good fit for where my priorities are right now. Right. So I think, and then, and I say this as a podcast host too, where sometimes we want to have guests on the show and we can't get them. And, it's because we don't have a big enough audience for them to want to come on our show. And that hurts a little bit, but it's also, everybody only has so much time. And I think I have to also be respectful of the idea that, they're making choices about how to spend their little precious hours of the day. And I don't know anything about their priorities or their life. And so, that doesn't necessarily have to reflect on me. That's the hardest part, right? Is to be able to say like, oh, whether they decide to do this or not, and whether like the audience I have and the size of the show or whatever, whether that is compelling to them or not, or whether this is interesting to them or not, this doesn't have anything to do with me. That is about them choosing things in their life. That is the hardest thing to remember, though, because it feels like rejection,
Well, and I totally get that. And I think I wasn't even aware of how vulnerable I was feeling, because I've been putting out requests to, in my estimation, a fair amount of people, and then that place of not knowing. And it wasn't until you responded like, yes, I'll be on, that I didn't realize how kind of, I don't mean defensive in a terrible way, but kind of how like that sense of vulnerability and inadequacy was there. Like, am I going to be chosen? And I don't want anybody to come on the podcast that has different priorities and values. I think we all need to make choices that work for us. But what I want this conversation to be about is like, these are the things that come up for everybody when we put ourselves out there and we risk, because we are vulnerable to having people say no. And it does sting when people say no, and we can move beyond it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, yeah, the best thing that I have been able to do, like my best way of processing that, is to be able to say, maybe that has maybe if somebody says no to being on my show, or frankly, just doesn't respond to the request, maybe what that means is that they, think that I suck, or I'm bad at what I do, or I'm boring, or whatever. But much more likely, right? Like much more likely, they are busy. They have their own priorities and their own interests and their own goals. And they just don't see this as being the right thing for them right now. And that is that's just about them. And it's just them doing their thing. And I think that's a hard thing to remember, but to sort of like, I don't want to say don't take it personally, because I feel like that's actually not very helpful advice. Everybody takes everything personally, but I think it's helpful to sort of separate out, okay, there's what they're doing. What they're doing is fine because they're making choices for themselves. I'm having an emotional reaction to it, which is also fine because I am a human and I have feelings, but that doesn't have to be anything more than that, right? It doesn't have to be anything more than, oh yeah, okay, they made a choice that worked for them. I'm having a reaction. I have feelings about it, and I'm going to let myself have those feelings without then saying, and I must be a bad person because they said no, or because I had the feelings, right? Like, it doesn't have to mean something greater than, oh, rejection sort of sucks. I'll pout for a minute and then move on with my life.
Right. I think there's a whole thing around expectations and disappointments that as kids, we aren't really encouraged to really feel what that feels like. So I think many of us get to the point of being adults and we get our expectations and our hopes. Those are both tied together. And so then when we get a no, it is frustrating and it is disappointing. And like you said, it doesn't necessarily have to be personal or about us, and allowing space for both of those, that it doesn't have to be a personal attack on who I am. It may not be a good fit. It may have nothing to do with me. And it sucks to be told no.
Yeah. It's all true at the same time.
Well, and it's interesting that I sent a request out to what I thought was a really big ask. And then I got something back from their publicist saying they're not accepting guests on their show right now. And so I had to write back like, I'm not really asking to be a guest on this person's show. I'm asking if they would be willing to be a guest on my show. And I got a no back right away. And I hate to say it, but it's almost better to not know. Like it just stung getting the no. Like, I'm fine, I live. But sometimes the not knowing feels a little bit more comfortable than having somebody go, nope, it's not going to work. And then just going like, okay, it's just not a fit for now.
Yeah, that's a personal thing too. I think I prefer to hear a clear no and move on.
That makes sense. I think it also depends on where we're at in building our business, what's going on with us and our whole life. That for me right now, things are very, very new. And so there's not what feels like a lot of solid groundwork. It feels way more risky and vulnerable right now to be putting things out because I don't feel like I have I'm a solid foundation in myself. And I can also see how hearing a no, like then you kind of cut ties and you move on. So I don't know. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Can we go back and talking about a little bit about marginalized groups? And you were talking about women of color in tech and just how hard it is for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Though, I certainly don't want to speak for experiences I don't have. But absolutely, yeah, I talk to all kinds of women who work in and adjacent to technology all the time. And I absolutely think that a lot of the efforts that have been made over the past few years to make tech a more welcoming place for women generally have been ultimately very focused on white women and have not done nearly enough to make it a more inclusive environment for other women.
Yeah. And I respect not going to a place where, we can't really speak from a place of experience. When you're working with women, what are some of the common fears that you see that come up as women start to step out on their own? The personal, like I call it gremlins. My audience knows what my gremlins are. I can give you some examples if you need, but what are some of the common fears that you see that come up for women?
Well, yeah, that's interesting. So I did a research project. Me and Cattell did this little research project last fall where we did a bunch of interviews with women in tech, design, and related fields. And, we did maybe a couple dozen of those. And then we did a survey where we asked more broadly. We talked to, got responses from, about 200 people, which wasn't limited to women, but was strongly skewing that way because of the networks we were sharing it with. And it was about, professional visibility, why you do or why you don't pursue things that would make you more visible professionally. And what are some of the barriers that you've hit in trying to do that? And when we did that research, it was really interesting to hear how often certain things would come up. So a big one was one that I mentioned earlier, which was almost all, a huge percentage of the people who responded, and especially women, would say that they would like to contribute, but they're scared they don't have enough experience or they think that they're not experts yet. And there was a sort of a sense of like, once I can check a couple more boxes professionally, then I'll be ready. Then I can do it. That was a really common one. But there were some others that came up over and over again. And I would say that a lot of the gremlins were around being scared of people reacting negatively. For example, I remember I talked to a woman who said, every time I express an opinion about design on Twitter, I get at least 5 men replying to tell me I'm wrong. And she is not only one of the most talented people I have ever met, like she's one of the most successful designers I know whose career is booming. And it's like she just invites these contrarians simply because she's a woman expressing an opinion.
So what do you think that's about? I'm sorry to derail you, but like, what do you think that's about? Let's talk about this honestly.
Well, what I think that's about is I think that there's a large culture of men who don't take women's perspective or expertise seriously and who will very quickly knock anything that they say simply by their assumption being they must not know what they're talking about.
Yeah. This is what we'd call manscaping, right?
Manscaping?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that means what you think it means.
Okay. Well, all right. Why don't you finish where you're going and then we'll come back to manscaping. Unless you want to do manscaping now.
Do you mean mansplaining?
Mansplaining. You're right. I'm sorry.
Manscaping is usually you may want to cut all this out. It's usually when people refer to, it's very slangy, but it would be when people refer to
hair removal.
Yeah.
I meant mansplaining.
So, yeah, I mean, I think some of it is a mansplaining thing. It's sort of an assumption that they have knowledge that she doesn't have. Some of it is, she happens to be somebody who has been like over mentored. As a young designer, men constantly wanted her to like be their mentee. And there's now this sense of, as a more experienced designer, that it's like people still want to perceive of her as being sort of like junior and it's like there's a lot of men who sort of like her in the role of muse and don't like her in the role of leader. And I think it comes up a lot. And I see this a lot with women in the way that they're perceived. It's like, if you're propping up the ego of an older man in your field, then you can be sort of like a darling for a while. But if you want to sort of stand on your own, then it's like, how dare you try to grab all that power, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think that there are a lot of those issues that face women, and they can be really demoralizing and destabilizing for women's careers. And so that goes back to the whole conversation about running the podcast, is that I think one of the most important reasons to have a show like ours is because women need to be able to hear about other women and prop up other women and to know that there's space for them to have those voices, and that what they're hearing in other circumstances and other environments is not the whole story, right? Like if all you ever hear from are people who sort of minimize you, question you, and all of that, it's really hard to maintain sort of a sense of self. It's hard to sort of like have the have the confidence and the sort of like rock solid self-worth to go through that and not have it chip away at you. And so I think you need those spaces where you can kind of like regain sustenance and power and sort of like regroup so that you can still make it out there into the world and like deal with it as it is and deal with all of the toxic BS you might have to deal with.
Yeah, it's like microaggressions, which are paper cuts. It's like death by 1,000 paper cuts.
Yeah. And I think that, I don't think you can get rid of the paper cuts, right? Like the microaggressions still exist. And I would love, 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 love to say that we could eliminate all of them. But the reality is, you still live and work in the world and you're still going to face those microaggressions, but you need somewhere safe to go to, right? So you need those safe places where you can have some healing and have some joy and trust that that's not going to happen to you. And I think it's important to create as many of those spaces as we can. And so that's what we try to do.
Yeah, I think we all need to find our tribe and our safe space where people can reflect back to us our strength and our magnificence, and be a container when we're having fears and doubts. And there's a safe space for that too. And people can reflect how that fits into the bigger picture. Because like we all go through that stuff, and we need to be held up during those times and hold other people up as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I had derailed you when I had talked about mansplaining and manscaping, but you were actually talking about the common fears that you saw that came up for women in tech. And that's when you were talking about this woman who was tweeting when I interrupted you.
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah. Common fears. I mean, we heard a lot of things around, I think that, like I'm afraid that all the good ideas are basically taken, right? That somebody else has already gotten to all the good ideas and I would just be regurgitating, or I don't have anything to add, which I think really comes from a place of feeling like, you haven't really looked at your particular strengths, and you haven't really looked at what makes your perspective unique, and you're quick to sort of write off the expertise that you do have. We also heard one of the other big challenges that I think can be a challenge for anybody, but is particularly a challenge for women, is that we definitely heard from a lot of people that they find it hard to find the time because they also have a lot of family obligations. They're in more of a caretaking role. They might have children. That, I think, is a very real piece of it, that, for women who are professionally ambitious, but also really engaged in, maintaining a family and a home, they tend to not have partners who are doing as much as they are doing at home. So that tends to be just one more thing. And so, at some point they have to make choices. And a lot of times the choices that they make are that they don't pursue the professionally ambitious stuff that they might otherwise want to pursue. And I think that's important to realize. We had a guest on the show the other day who was talking about things like family leave policy and the way that our country really is not doing enough for working mothers, particularly because we've built a society where moms have to work, right? Like, it's not even, in most families, like, that's not even really an option. Yet we're really unwilling to sort of like deal with what that means for our society at large. And so I think that, we have to recognize that some of the stressors that get placed on women is that you always have to be so many things in a way that nobody seems to really expect men to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the burden really does fall on women to kind of do it all and have it all. And oftentimes things are not equally distributed as far as responsibilities and chores. And that makes it really tough.
Well, and so much of that labor goes unnoticed. This guest we had on, Amy Westervelt, she talked about how she used to interview a lot of like business leaders, and she was a journalist. She was on this beat where she was doing a lot of business stuff. And she started asking every male CEO she talked with, so how do you balance work and family? And they would just look at her like they had no idea why she was asking that. But she basically was like, look, women get asked this all the time, and I'm tired of this being only a question we ask women. And then also, what she found is that when they actually stopped and thought about it, the answer to that question was almost always, well, I have a ton of help at home, right? That I have paid help, that I have a wife that doesn't work, or whatever, right? Like, they have this combination of things that allows them to quote unquote balance that is a lot of work being done by other people. And those other people are almost always women. Women tend to have a lot less of that. They tend to have a lot less help at home. And the work that they have to do to keep things running doesn't get treated as work. And it is, right? Like, the little details of running a household and remembering that you're out of paper towels or whatever, like that's work. And that's a cognitive load to bear. And we have to be able to talk about it as such. And we have to be able to acknowledge that is a very real part of people's lives, and that it is absolutely something that can get in the way. And, and it's not to say that all of that work, like, women should just stop doing it necessarily or whatever. I do think there's certainly something to be said for rebalancing roles in homes and rebalancing roles in our society. But I think just not acknowledging that it exists and that it's labor and that it takes a lot to do, I think, is the real problem to start with.
Right. It's interesting, as you were talking, I kind of had this whole little thing going on in my head. It started with when you see men who are caring for children, they get a lot of attention for, oh, you're stepping up and you're being involved and you're taking care of your kids. And, if we look back traditionally where men worked and women stayed home with their kids, and then women joined the workforce and women continued to assume responsibility for all of the family responsibilities. So, a woman out with her kids doesn't get the accolades that a dad gets if he's out with his kids. When is it going to shift so that the division of responsibility is really shared and that it's not seen as women's work or special that dads are spending time with their kids?
Yeah, and that kind of stuff, those shifts take a lot of time, and they take a lot of sort of like, it's an ongoing boulder you got to push up the hill to make those things change. And it's like, until that stuff shifts, all of the work that you might do in your personal life to try to quote unquote have it all, it's never really, like, it doesn't work, right? You can never really perfectly do it. You do the best you can given the reality that exists, but the structural and societal issues are not something you can get away from by, your personal effort, no matter how hard you lean in or whatever.
Sure. Sara, I want to take a little bit of a shift now. If you were able to talk to your younger self, what would you want to tell her?
I think that I would probably tell her that she's doing fine. I think that there's lots and lots and lots of advice that I could give to her. And there's certainly things that I would do differently if I could do them over. But I think that I was hard on myself and I'm still sometimes hard on myself. And that wasn't necessarily helpful to me. And it, setting myself up to feel a lot of shame and feel a lot of insecurity and not measuring up and to feel like I wasn't measuring up to other people. I think that comparativeness that you can get into a lot of times really does come from this place of not feeling like you are enough on your own. And so being able to just say like, no, really, like you're doing okay. You can just be, you're fine would be really valuable.
Yeah. I really think too that many times our parents didn't really have the language of feelings. So we would feel things and our parents weren't able to acknowledge it. And I think that's often where that sense that we get that message that who we are is not okay. And if we were only doing things better or smarter or faster, that we internalize so many of the unspoken ways that our parents were not able to see and hear us as children. There's just so much wounding that goes on there. And had we had parents that were able to say like, all your feelings are okay, everything about you is okay, we would get that message. I mean, I'm not saying this is specifically what's going on in your case, but that's just what kind of dropped in for me because I also struggle with comparing, and it never turns out in my favor when I get into that thing of comparing. And that really, for me, comes back to like, am I okay? Is who I am okay? Are my feelings okay? Yeah, just my thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that a lot of people didn't grow up with great language around feelings or, encouragement to have feelings, right? Like you hear stories of people sort of being shushed and told to stop being emotional. And women get told that a lot. I've certainly been told I'm too emotional or too sensitive or whatever. And I think that comes from oftentimes from people's own fear about their own feelings, right? Like they're scared of their own feelings. And so they don't want to see them in somebody else.
Right. There's something called childhood emotional neglect. And often people grow up thinking that they had great childhoods because you don't know that you're missing something that you didn't get. And I think it's really common, especially if you look at the older generations where it was really about survival and pull yourself up by the bootstraps, because that's what immigrants had to do when they came to this country. And there really wasn't awareness about our feelings. And now there's been research done, and there are a couple of books on childhood emotional neglect. So many people who feel like they're not good enough or something is just missing or a sense of emptiness comes from that sense of not growing up having that emotional language and having our feelings mirrored back to us. Yeah. Okay, that was a little diatribe, but a worthwhile one. Can you tell us about any projects that you're working on right now?
Well, like I said, I am working on some of this research that me and Cattell have been doing around professional visibility. So we're starting to do some writing around that and putting together some workshops on that. And then we've got our podcast, which is every Thursday, which that weekly schedule sure keeps you young, I guess.
And you guys made it into new and notable. I'm having a little bit of fangirl envy.
Yeah, it's interesting getting picked up by some of the podcast platforms and sort of what they hone in on and what they notice, what they don't. But I think the thing is that, that we realize is that getting onto one of those lists can give you a little blip for a minute, but so much of it over time is just about, do you do something that people really relate to? Do they find it compelling? And can you get them to keep coming back week after week, which is always such a tough thing.
Right. It's easy, especially for me as a new podcaster, being caught up in the number and the downloads. And there's a part of that that's valuable because I need to see what's resonating with the listeners. And I think podcasting is really about being in it for the long run and coming up with content that's valuable to your listeners. And so it's that balance between the yin and the yang. Yeah. Where can people find you?
Sure. So I am at Sara, just SARAWB.com. You can get our podcast at strongfeelings.co. And you can find me on Twitter at Sara_Ann_Marie.
Sounds great. And I'll have all that stuff in the show notes too. Is there anything else that you wanted to share that I didn't ask you about before we go?
No, I feel like I got all my feelings out.
I'm so glad. Thank you so much for being here with me today, Sara. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Patricia.
All right. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. If you're enjoying this podcast, please rate and review. It makes the podcast easier for others to find. You can rate it on your iPhone in the podcast app, or you can go to unapologeticallysensitive.com and click on one of the more recent episodes, and there are instructions and links in the show notes so you can rate this podcast. If you have questions or comments, I love hearing from you. Please reach out to me at unapologeticallysensitive@gmail.com. We have a closed Facebook group called Unapologetically Sensitive, where we're building a great community. Remember, sensitivity is nothing to apologize for. It's our superpower. Have a blessed day.